There's been a remarkable change in the human body over the last several decades. Body weight is increasing. All over the world, people are getting plump and in a number of cases even downright fat. The obvious question is, what's changed? This is a question for a lot of social scientists, and of course public health professionals are at the front lines for how this trend affects health. But food is a product that is bought and sold, and a lot of the exercise that many people get relates to their conditions of work. Eating and exercise are both related to incentives and trade-offs, so this is a natural area where economists should have something to say. The average weight of an American male adult was 168 pounds in the early 1960s, about 190 pounds by the early 2000s. The average weight of an American female adult was 143 pounds in the early 1960s and 163 pounds in the early 2000s. In other words, on average, both men and women gained more than 20 pounds between the early 1960s and the early 2000s. Now it's true, the average adult was also a little taller over this time frame, but only about an inch taller on average, which is not enough to explain the weight gain that occurred. At what point does this weight gain become a legitimate public health concern? After all, Americans have been gaining weight for most of the 20th century. However, health experts say that most Americans actually weighed too little for optimal health at the start of the 20th century. And so a lot of the weight gain that happened was actually a measure of improved health. What's the dividing line between when gains in weight turn into being overweight or being obese? In the research literature, obesity is usually measured by something called the body mass index. The technical definition works this way. Take weight, measured in kilograms, then take height, measured in meters, and square that number. That is, raise it to the power of 2. Now, take the weight measure, divide by the result of the height calculation. And in these kinds of studies, it's standard to label adults with a body mass index between 25 and 30 as overweight and adults above 30 as obese. Now, this sort of number is perhaps not a huge help for those of us who tend to think in pounds for weight and feet and inches for height. You can work out your own body mass index at any number of websites where you plug in pounds and feet and inches and it'll do the calculation for you. But for those who operate with these measurements, someone who is 6 feet tall would have a body mass index of about 25 if they weighed 184 pounds. That's the dividing line between the preferred weight and being overweight. Somebody who's 6 feet tall would have a body mass index of 30 when they weigh 221 pounds. That would be the line between being overweight and being obese. For this person who's 6 feet tall, 1 point on the body mass index represents about 7.5 pounds. Now, body mass index is not a perfect measure by any means. There are plenty of examples of, say, top athletes, like some pro football players, who would have low body fat, but they would be overweight or obese by this height and weight kind of definition. Some people will be healthy with a little more weight, some people with a little less weight. The point isn't that this is a perfect diagnostic measure of health. The point is that taking population as a whole, you need some measuring stick for thinking about obesity. The body mass index has the great advantage that you can calculate it just based on height and weight, not on more complex health statistics. And so it's something that can be calculated for lots of different times and places based on data that already exists. In 1962, obesity measured this way among U.S. adults aged 20 to 72 was 13%. In recent years, obesity has nearly tripled from that level and is now above 35%. This is a rise that goes across all different groups. There's more obesity for men, there's more obesity for women. It does tend to be true that those with low education are more likely to be obese than those with higher education, but that was true in 1962, and it's also true today. Obesity rates for every education group are way, way up over time. Although my focus here is going to be on U.S. evidence and data, there's also an international effect that's important here. Rising obesity rates affect every high-income country. For the world as a whole, there are some estimates, based on inevitably shaky data, that the number of obese people now outstrips the number of malnourished people for the world as a whole. However, the US is the world leader among high-income countries, with the highest percentage of its population being obese. You can imagine we're number one, although you don't usually hear the crowds chanting for this particular statistic. The health costs of obesity are tricky to measure because it can be very hard to sort out cause and effect here. Ideally, what you'd like to do is compare two groups of people who have different weights, but in all the other things that affect health are exactly the same. The truth is that those who are obese may also have other issues affecting health. For example, they may have less exercise, a less healthy diet, perhaps different access to health care, a lot of other factors that can affect life expectancy as well. But as a basic measure, it's true that those who have a body mass index of, say, 35 at age 20s and 30s will typically live perhaps 3 years less on average than those who are not obese. Now, the effects of obesity on life expectancy are tricky. It seems, for example, that being just mildly overweight and not obese doesn't have much connection to life expectancy, especially for those who are in their 30s or older. When you're really old, being overweight really doesn't have much effect on your remaining life expectancy. For African Americans, those who are overweight or slightly obese actually have a longer life expectancy on average than those who are just under that overweight line, those who have a body mass index around 24. Now, you can go neck deep into the public health literature on just how to figure out the pure health effect of just obesity and nothing else, no other related traits on health. Here, I'm just going to duck the tricky cause and effect questions. And for the estimates I'll talk about, I'll go with the basic connection that those who are obese in their 20s and 30s will end up living 2 to 3 years less than those who are not. The other main health cost of obesity is increased medical costs, but this is a little tricky to think about too. It's true that in any given year, those who are obese tend to have higher health costs than those who are not obese. It is also true that those who are obese die younger. So, if there are higher costs per year, but a lower number of years of life, at least in theory, it could work out that over a lifetime, obese people either spend more or less on health care. It turns out that when you put together the higher annual costs for health for those who are obese, along with lower life expectancy, one study found that obesity increases the lifetime medical care costs for 50-year-olds by about $15,000. However, for 65-year-olds, obesity is only about a $5,000 lifetime increase in medical care costs, and if you're over 75, those over 75 experience no lifetime increase in medical care costs. In fact, they experience a modest cost decrease. So, at some level, these are not huge dollar amounts. But if you think about it a little bit, a number of obese people don't have any particular symptoms for a long time until some big-time health issue comes up, like perhaps a heart attack or a stroke. If you think about it, a $15,000 bill is in a way a fairly big-time health episode. It's not just the extra costs of buying high blood pressure medication or something like that. When economists need to put a value on the additional year of life in their calculations, they often end up choosing some number like an extra year of life is worth $100,000 or maybe $200,000. These sorts of numbers are typically based on extrapolating from other risky behaviors, like how much do people get paid extra if they have jobs that have a lot of risk to them, to their health? Or how much are people willing to spend for certain things around their home or their job that will provide them with a certain kind of a safety benefit? Now, my point here isn't to delve into how you extrapolate from those kinds of numbers to get estimates of what a year of life is worth, but I'm just going to point out that several years of life is a lot more costly than the additional healthcare costs of obesity. Whether you think that a year of life is worth $100,000 or $200,000 or much more than that, most people would say a couple of extra years of life is worth a fairly large amount. The bottom line here is the costs of lower life expectancy resulting from obesity are probably a lot larger than the healthcare costs that result from greater obesity. Now, this insight matters for various reasons, but one reason is that when it comes to public policy about obesity, it matters whether the costs of obesity are being carried by those who are actually carrying the extra weight, or whether the costs are carried by others through private and public health insurance programs. The healthcare costs of life expectancy, after all, are costs the obese person ends up paying personally. We'll come back to this point more at the end of the lecture when we talk about public policy. What I want to do first of all is to discuss various reasons proposed by economists and other social scientists as to why obesity has increased. In thinking about the reasons for the rise in overeating over the last few decades, the basic choices are pretty obvious. Calories enter the body by eating, and calories are burned by physical activity. Thus, rising weight must mean some combination of either eating more or burning less. The less exercise explanation has a substantial problem. There's not really any data that suggests a big drop in exercise over the last 30 or 40 years. An argument you sometimes hear is that jobs are less physically taxing than they used to be. That is, more people work in offices, fewer people work in agriculture or loading freight, and even jobs like manufacturing are in some ways less physically taxing than they used to be. For the first half of the 20th century, it's plausible to argue there was a big shift taking place in terms of how much physical effort was needed in day-to-day life, because that's a time when lots of workers were in jobs like agriculture and manufacturing, which involved a lot of physical labor. But what we're talking about here is an increase in obesity since the 1970s or maybe the 1980s. The shift to office work is largely over before this starts. In fact, we also have evidence from time diaries, which tells things like how much physical effort is spent on the job, how much recreation time is spent doing nothing, and so on. The general pattern you get out of this evidence is there hasn't been a decrease in physical activity in the last 30 or 40 years. The data is a little shaky here. You have to interpret what people are saying about their activities, but actually it looks more like there's been a small increase in physical activity over that time. Other facts also lean against an explanation for obesity based on exercise. For example, kids didn't work 40 years ago, and they don't work now. But child obesity is way up. It's probably true that the elderly today are more active than they used to be 30 or 40 years ago, but obesity among the elderly is up as well. Now, the result of this sort of line of argument is that the main focus of explaining the rise in obesity has focused more on calories consumed than on an exercise-based explanation. And when it comes to consuming calories, you can break it down into three categories. About 10% of the calories you eat are burned in digestion. That's sometimes called thermic burn. An adult burns about 1,800 calories a day at rest, and that varies, of course, by how big you are, your age, your metabolism, your gender, and some things like that. So if you eat about 2,000 calories a day, 10% of that goes to thermic burn, 1,800 go to keeping your body going at rest, then the additional calories are related to how much extra exercise you get over the day. And that's the third way of burning calories. Data that show diaries of food and time use suggest that average calories did go up in the 1980s, from a bit more than 1,900 calories per person to about 2,100 calories per person. If you round it off a bit, you could call this an increase of 150 calories a day on average. Now, this seems small in a way. I mean, after all, 150 calories is 1 can of sugared soda or a 1-ounce bag of potato chips, or maybe just slightly larger servings of what you would eat anyway. But it turns out that if you do the calculations of calories in, calories out, this rise of about 150 calories a day on average consumption can explain the average gains in weight and obesity that have actually occurred. Why might calories consumed rise? Well, a starting point here is to note a basic fact about body reactions in overeating. Most body reactions are fairly immediate. There's a loud noise, you hear it right away. If there's something that might be dangerous, if it was a jungle cat for a caveman, or a car that's weaving around as if the driver is drunk, you see it right away. You think about it right away. If you taste something that's terrible, your body worries it might be dangerous and you push it away. But when you're eating, there's no immediate signal about when you're full. It's easy to eat too much and not really realize you're full, and then 15 minutes later, 30 minutes later, an hour later, you think, goodness gracious, I just can't believe I ate that entire thing. Now, in an evolutionary sense, there are probably good reasons for this. Humans long ago didn't know where their next meal was coming from, and they needed to be able to overeat to build up calories, in case the rest of the day or the next day or two there wasn't much food. But for most of us today, there's no need to stock up on calories for the next day or two until we can hunt down a gazelle or something like that. This pattern also means we can be especially susceptible to food marketing. If something says it's low fat, you grab it off the shelf and don't notice that it's low fat but more calories. Or if something says fortified with vitamins, well, many things are, but how many calories does it have? It also means we can be especially susceptible to changes in incentives because our body doesn't give us immediate feedback on overeating. Now, one possible theory for the rise in obesity is that over the decades, people have gradually had higher incomes and they can afford to buy more food. But this doesn't seem to explain the pattern of obesity that's emerged. After all, income has been rising over the long run, but it didn't seem to lead to obesity until around 1980. It's not clear why that should be so. It's also true that those with high incomes are not more obese than those with lower incomes. Actually, the reverse pattern is true. Those with high incomes do spend more money on food, but it's easy to spend a lot of money on food without necessarily affecting how many calories are consumed. It's true that it's possible to buy a lot of junk food cheaply with very high calorie counts. You look into a fast food place at some point, look at the price of a salad, and then compare the calories you could buy if you got all the cheap stuff that's on the menu. It's similarly, some want to blame the U.S. government's agricultural support program. Those policies have held down the price of food over time. But these policies have been in place since back in the 1920s. It's not clear why they should have started a wave of obesity in the 1980s. So, if income and changes in prices are not central to explaining the rise in obesity, where do we turn next? Another set of explanations focuses on changes in food preparation technology. The cost of food is measured not just in money, but also in terms of how much time does it take to prepare it. And this time has really dropped a lot. In the 1960s, it was common for someone in the household, typically the wife, to spend on average more than 2 hours a day on food prep. A group of economists at Harvard University, in particular David Cutler and Edward Glaser, have emphasized that obesity is linked to a change in the technology of food preparation. Cutler and Glaser point out there are 5 major areas of technology that affect the ability to prepare food in one place, at least partially, and then have it consumed someplace else. Those 5 areas of technology are controlling the atmosphere, preventing spoilage due to microorganisms, preserving flavor, preserving moisture, and controlling temperature. And they argue there have been big innovations in all of these areas in recent decades. Along with these changes, there's been widespread use of microwave ovens for quick and easy heating. You can illustrate a lot of this with the story of the potato. Americans used to eat their potatoes baked, boiled, or mashed. Now, Americans typically eat French fries, which are often peeled and cut and partly cooked in one location, then frozen and shipped somewhere else. They can be reheated in a deep fryer, like in many restaurants, or in an oven or a microwave. U.S. consumption of potatoes went up 30% from 1977 to 1995, and almost all of that was higher consumption of French fries and potato chips. Now, in the nature of things, it's hard to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that new technologies of food development were the key factor in a rise in obesity. But you can say that it fits a lot of the facts pretty well. It dovetails with a lot of other patterns people have observed. For example, the timing of the development and diffusion of these technologies of new food preparation is about right to match with the higher obesity that's occurred. It fits with the idea of more snacks. Prepared food is cheaper and easier to get. It's easier for restaurants to supersize their portions because of all the advanced prep happening somewhere else. After all, fast food places could have decided to continually cut price and offer the same size serving, but instead they decided to compete by offering more and more and more volume. Kind of the way car companies could compete by offering the best mileage, but they tend to compete by providing more horsepower and different kinds of styling instead. There's also been a change in the frequency of food consumption. This is sometimes called the grazing phenomenon. And snacks are what have increased, easily prepared food that's readily available. Food diaries, where people record what they actually eat, suggest the amount of calories consumed in meals has actually gone down a bit, but the amount consumed in snacks has been increasing over time. The new patterns of food preparation, the new technologies, also fit with the pattern of obesity across countries. Countries that have more regulations about food have taken less advantage of these new food preparation technologies, and they haven't experienced the same change in obesity as has the United States. I'm thinking here of countries like Italy, France, and Japan. They also have fewer microwaves in those countries and more time spent cooking. And this also fits with the idea, many of the arguments, about how people eat out and eat more fast food. The reason fast food is such a cheap way to eat is these changes in food production technology have worked so very well. Finally, these changes in food technology affect fruit and vegetables and fresh produce much, much less. So the prices of fruit and vegetables haven't gone down as much as the price of many other things you can eat. Over time, food prep has been much easier to do. Foods with a large degree of commercial preparation are things that people are eating more and more of. Foods with less degree of commercial preparation are things people are eating less and less and less of over time. The idea of a lower time cost of food preparation also suggests that this should have an especially big effect on those who have self-control issues, because it's easy to get food really quickly. So if there's a small group that has self-control problems, what we ought to observe is not just that obesity rises, but that there's a group of extremely obese folks who really are taken in by the ease of getting these kinds of food, and that is the pattern we actually see. Now again, none of this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the technology of food preparation is the only factor in encouraging obesity. All of these other things are interrelated factors, some of which have good independent weight of their own. But I do think overall the evidence is pretty persuasive that these new developments in food prep technology are one of the really important factors which is underlying a lot of these other things and which have helped lead to greater obesity. Now let's turn to issues of public policy and obesity. A standard argument for why public policy should seek to reduce healthcare costs is, you'll hear people say, we all end up paying the health costs of obesity through health insurance. That is, most of us are insured through some sort of group. It could be an employer group or a public group or some other pool of people. If some subset of that group has systematically higher healthcare costs, like the obese, then there's a sense in which everyone else in the group is subsidizing that particular subgroup. Now that sounds plausible, but it's probably a misguided argument, and here's why. Studies of labor markets and insurance suggest the obese are paid systematically less than the non-obese, who have the same education level and experience. And this is just discrimination, as we talked about in earlier lectures. Two economists named Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford University and Niraj Sood from the University of Southern California looked at this well-known effect more closely. And they found that this wage bias against the obese actually exists only in the group of companies that offer health insurance to their employees. This is a really remarkable finding. It suggests that given the amount of bias that exists in wages and the costs of healthcare, it turns out the obese do end up paying for their healthcare costs. They pay for it in the form of lower wages at employers who provide health insurance to their employees. Moreover, we already noted earlier that the main costs of obesity are in terms of the health of the obese themselves, their shorter life expectancy, and that's a cost the obese pay personally. Indeed, you can even argue, although it's a little uncomfortable to do so in some ways, that the obese provide a financial benefit to the rest of us. For example, the obese die earlier, which means they collect less in Social Security and other pension benefits. High obesity has also meant lots of research and development on issues like heart disease, and the non-obese benefit from the fruits of that research if they get heart disease. Without obesity, that research might not have been pushed with the same vigor. This raises a question which I think is a genuinely hard one. Is obesity something that's mainly between a person and their family and their doctor and really not anyone else's business? Or is obesity a more complex situation in this sense? Lots of people who are overweight would actually like to lose some of that weight, but they have a hard time doing so. If that's true, government might have a role in helping people to do some of those things they truly want to do, even though they don't have the discipline or the self-control to do it very easily. A common metaphor here is behavior about smoking. Lots of people who smoke say they want to quit. In fact, they pay money for programs and products to help them quit, but they clearly have a hard time doing so. You could argue that a government cigarette tax is a way of helping people quit. Of course, it doesn't work for everybody, and maybe not everybody wants to quit, but you could argue that for those who do want to quit smoking, a cigarette tax is a little bit of help in pushing them down that path. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that some government policies are justified to help those who are overweight make the choices they're having a hard time making by themselves. Other than price, what sort of government policies might be used? Well, you can think of public education and persuasion as one set of policies. Sometimes we call this the bully pulpit, what Michelle Obama has tried to do as First Lady. You try and remind people of good, healthy eating habits. That probably does some good. It's unlikely to do any harm. You can label food so people can see calorie counts and vitamins, and again, this probably does some good. It's unlikely to do any harm. But it's worth noting that the history of the government, the US government, giving advice on food isn't all that great. Historically, food advice from the US government has often tended to encourage consumption of stuff the government is subsidizing, stuff like wheat and dairy and meat, with considerably less emphasis on things like vegetables or beans. Beyond education, the next step may be thinking about the choices people face. Schools and places of employment, for example, are places where people eat in a pretty structured environment. For example, you could think about in that soda machine in schools, how about if all or almost all of it is diet soda or diet lemonade, zero-calorie water, so people aren't drinking calories all day? If there's a snack machine in an office or a school, how about having some raisins or some apples or some stuff in there that isn't all sugar and candy bars? The next step might be just a little bit stronger. What about if we had a fast food tax? There are real issues here, classifying what's fast food and what's not, and what's a snack and what's not, and that all can get pretty political in states which have tried to go down this path. It can also lead to some genuinely difficult trade-offs. For example, it's just a fact that for many low-income families, much of the meat that their children eat comes from fast food restaurants. If you have a tax on fast food, you run a real risk of creating higher anemia rates among children from certain low-income families. You got to remember that if you tax fast food or snacks, it's not clear the alternative is a healthy home-cooked meal. The alternative might be a coffee cake in the microwave or a frozen pizza. It's worth remembering just because you tax one kind of food doesn't mean the next choice is going to be healthier or better. People's food choices just aren't all that simple. Ultimately, all the policy choices about weight loss face a tough question. There's no shortage of weight loss plans and groups out there in the market economy to try and encourage people to lose weight. But if people don't lose weight when they're willing to pay for it, why do you think a little tax here or there is going to make a substantial difference? What about weight loss plans for the average person? The standard advice is diet and exercise, but actually up until the 1990s, the standard advice was just diet. Exercise does have a variety of benefits for things like cardiovascular fitness, bone density, and the like, but in terms of fighting obesity, exercise and diet are really not 50-50 options. And the reason is simple enough. Say I get on an exercise bike and I ride it pretty hard, at least for me, for a half hour. The little number on the dial tells me I've burned 150, 200 calories. But then if I go out and get one muffin, or a big juice drink, or I stop at a fast food place after leaving the gym, I can easily consume enough to offset the calories I just burned. Or maybe at my next meal, because I exercised, I feel extra hungry, and I reward myself for the exercise by having a little bigger portion, or a second helping, or having a larger dessert. From a calorie counting point of view, it's really easy to offset exercise very, very quickly. The only good news here is this imbalance works in reverse. If you can just do things like avoid eating the French fries at lunch, or find something for breakfast that's not a big muffin or a big sugary, creamy, coffee-related beverage, if you can avoid ever drinking sugared soda again, you can knock off that 150 calories a day, and that gradually will lead to weight loss. The problem is that this emphasizes a lot of us would like to have a diet be something we could do once a day. Take a pill, eat a food, spend a half hour at the gym, and then we can just go on with our lives and not worry about it. But food intake and food output doesn't work that way. It needs to be a steady and ongoing process about redefining your relationship to food, at least in mild ways. The most sensible dietary advice I've seen in recent years is from Marion Nestle, a sociology professor at New York University, who often writes about food and politics. Her basic advice for dieting is eat less, move more. Eat fruits and vegetables, don't eat too much junk food, and enjoy.